Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Miguel Rosas Buendia. I am assistant professor of Spanish in the School of Modern Languages here at Georgia Tech. We are here now for the next keynote speaker, Jessica Hernandez. But before introducing her I would like to share some information, basic information about this project that I have at Georgia Tech with a colleague from the History and Sociology, School of History and Sociology, Germán Vergara. We have this initiative called Latin American Environmental Humanities Lab, which is an environmental humanities initiative here at Georgia Tech. And trying to make a connection with the previous talk, and we saw in the image that Nelson Maldonado shared with us this UN wheel, right, with the colors. And what I have introduced in the webpage of our project is this textile from Andean peoples, pre-Hispanic Andean peoples in Peru, where I am from. And trying to communicate a very simple idea, which is one way, of course, to think sustainability and environmental issues today. And there are many other histories to share from the past and, of course, in the present, thinking of the future. That's something that is there. And we also have, you see here the name of the webpage. We have different initiatives. One of them is a podcast that is called Amatle. Matle is a word from Nahuatl, an indigenous language from Mexico, the language of the Aztecs. And Amatle is a word that you see there that means it's the name of a tree, but it's also the name of a bark that was used by Mesoamerican cultures to create paper. It's also a word for paper. So Amatle, meaning paper, is a technology for communication, right? As a podcast is a technology for communication. So the name of the podcast honor this knowledge and trying to make a connection between the past, a technology of communication, and a podcast, a digital way of communication. So that's why it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Jessica Hernandez, because here you're taking my different classes. I always include issues and topics around indigenous populations of the Americas with emphasis in the Andean region where I am from, and which is the area that I know better. And that's why it's a pleasure for me to introduce Jessica. Jessica Hernandez is an indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an academic background spanning marine sciences and environmental physics. Through her scientific and community work, she advocates for climate justice and land rights. She's the author of the award-winning book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. She's currently working on her second book, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots of Climate Displacements and Justice. Forbes has named Hernandez one of the most powerful and influential women in Central America. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
So thank you for the introduction, Paduchi Wendell Buguri. My name is Jessica Hernandez, and today I will be presenting on Indigenous science from the local to the global context. Okay. So I would like to thank everyone who organized this symposium and conference, and we hope that we can unlearn and relearn some of the ways that we have been taught, especially in the sciences. So before I begin diving into my presentation, I would like to kind of give you more of a perspective of where my work comes from. I am Maya Chorti, meaning that my people experienced a genocide in the 1960s. Unfortunately, in the 1999, that's when the UN officially classified the Central American Civil War or armed conflict, as is known in Guatemala, as a genocide, given that it targeted indigenous Maya peoples. We have been hearing this notion that history tends to repeat itself. And in this case, the same thing happened where our men and children were targeted. And I think that as Indigenous peoples, given today's current situations and genocides that are taking place in Gaza, Congo, and Sudan, it kind of resurfaces many of the traumas and historical accounts that we have. For me, a genocide wasn't that long ago. It was in my parents, in my father's generation, as well as my grandparents' generation. So I wanted to acknowledge that, especially given how my identity is kind of based on genocide that's not that long ago. I also come from the Binisa Nation, one of the only remaining matriarchal societies within the global context when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And what that means is that it's the opposite of a patriarchy, where our women and our third gender, known as the muses, have power and autonomy. They can own land. They are the leaders in their households. If we were in our communities, our matriarchs will be the first ones to speak, then our women, then our muses, and our men will be the last to speak. So it's been interesting, right? Growing up in a matriarchal society and then coming to the United States and pursuing my education here since K through 12, given that, I was taught that a woman should be loud and outspoken versus here in the US, we see how as women, we are expected to be more submissive and soft spoken. So for me, it's kind of like adapting to the society and the current situations that as women we experience. So, I want to acknowledge the power that comes from Indigenous women and acknowledge that my work hasn't been something that I have accomplished by myself, but beside me are the powerful Indigenous women, including my grandmother, tias, aunts, and mom, and everyone who is a part of my community. So I want to bring them forward as I present today. I also want to also mention that my trajectory as an Indigenous scientist started and was rooted from my father's teachings. He was an Indigenous child when he experienced the worst things that a child can experience, which is war and genocide. And even despite that, one of the teachings that he embedded in me at a young age is that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. And that is the basis of the book that I wrote, Fresh Banana Leaves, where I share his story as an Indigenous child who sought nature as his refuge, especially given that he was experiencing atrocities, right? Especially as a child. His innocence, their innocence is kind of stolen from them at a young age. If you ask my father if he considered himself as a child when he was experiencing this war, he will say no, that he was already grown, but he was 12, right? So that kind of makes us realize that war has a huge impact, especially on our children. But despite all of that, and despite all the accolades and higher education that I pursued, I still say that my father is more knowledgeable about our environments than any professor I have met, or even myself. And that's because he is rooted, his whole teachings and upbringing are rooted in Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous sciences, which I will speaking about today, and kind of facilitating the Q&A as we move forward towards the end. As I continue, it's also important to note that one Indigenous person cannot speak for our Indigenous peoples. And that's because as Indigenous peoples, we're not a monolith. And our knowledge systems or Indigenous science is place-based. So I just wanted to put that in the center stage, especially as I continue my presentation. So right now we're going to watch a video, and then one of the questions and I'm going to kind of ask for audience participation. And the question that I will have for everyone is, do you consider this an example of science? And please explain why. So make sure you pay attention to the video, and then we can move into a conversation.
Imagine setting sail from Hawaii in a canoe. Your target is a small island thousands of kilometers away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's a body of water that covers more than 160 million square kilometers, greater than all the land masses on Earth combined. For thousands of years, Polynesian navigators managed voyages like this without the help of modern navigational aids. Ancient Polynesians used the sun, moon, stars, planets, ocean currents, and clouds as guides that allowed them to see the ocean as a series of pathways rather than an obstacle. Their voyages began around 1500 BC, when the people who would settle Polynesia first set sail from Southeast Asia. Early Polynesians eventually settled a vast area of islands spread over 40 million square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean. Some historians believe the voyagers moved from place to place to avoid overpopulation, others that they were driven by war. Voyages became less frequent by around 1300 AD as Polynesian societies became more rooted in specific locations. During the voyaging period, successful journeys depended on a number of factors: well-built canoes, the skill of navigators, and weather being some of the biggest. Voyages relied on sturdy va'akalua, or double-hulled canoes, which were powered by sails and steered with a single large oar. Canoe building involved the whole community, bringing together the navigators, canoe builders, priests, chanters, and hula dancers. Navigators were keen observers of the natural world. They were abundantly familiar with trade-wind-generated ocean swells, which typically flow northeast or southeast. By day, navigators could identify direction by the rocking motion of their canoes caused by these swells. But sunrise and sunset were even more useful. The sun's position indicated east and west and created low light on the ocean that made it possible to see swells directly. At night, navigators used something called a star compass, which wasn't a physical object, but rather a sort of mental map. They memorized the rising and setting points of stars and constellations at different times of the year. They used those to divide the sky into 4 quadrants, subdivided into 32 houses, with the canoe in the middle. So, for example, when they saw the star Pura Atea rising from the ocean, they knew that to be northeast. They had some other tricks too. The Earth's axis points towards Hokupa'a, or the North Star, so called because it's the one fixed point in the sky as the Earth rotates, and always indicates north. However, it's not visible south of the equator, so navigators there could use a constellation called Neve, or the Southern Cross, and some mental tricks to estimate where south is. For instance, draw a line through these 2 stars, extend it 4.5 times, and draw another line from there to the horizon. That's south. But the sky also contains navigational aids much closer to Earth: the clouds. Besides being useful weather cues, under the right conditions, they can indicate land masses. For instance, the lagoons of Pacific atolls can actually be seen reflected on the underside of clouds, if you know what to look for. And high masses of clouds can indicate mountainous islands. Once navigators neared their destination, other clues such as the flight patterns of birds, floating debris or vegetation, and types of fish in the area helped determine the proximity of land. For example, the Manuoku had a known flight range of 190 kilometers and could be followed back to shore. So how do we know all of this? Partially through evidence in petroglyphs, written observations of European explorers, and Polynesian oral traditions, but also by trying them out for ourselves. In 2017, a voyaging canoe called Hokulea completed a worldwide voyage using only these techniques. If that seems remarkable, remember the ancient Polynesians, who through close study and kinship with nature were able to forge these paths across an unfathomably vast, vibrant, living ocean.
Okay, thank you. So the question I have for the audience is, do you view this as a scientific example, yes or no? And you can raise your hand. There's no wrong answers, and I can pass the mic. Who wants to go first?
Thank you. If scientific is meant in a kind of traditional Western way, based on observation, data, analysis, et cetera, yes. But I think it's a lot more than that. You know, the communion with nature, the understanding of nature, not commanding nature and, you know, reducing it to a petri dish or some kind of other, you know, metadata analysis. So yes, and many different ways, yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Do you view this example as a scientific example, yes or no? No wrong answers. Don't feel intimidated. Maybe one more person who's going to be the brave volunteer. Oh, I see a hand over there.
I think this shows how science is culturally defined
Mhm,
and time, temporality and how science operates.
mhm. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Did I miss a hand? Okay. Yeah, so that's very interesting, right? Because we know that for generations, Indigenous peoples have contributed to these fields that we see as science. But yet, if you were to take a marine science class or an oceanography class, we will read that the first pioneer is Captain James Cook, who was an English sea captain. And, he's quoted and given the recognition to be one of the first to make scientific observations while navigating the seas. And he did 3 voyages, explore all oceans, first to see the Antarctic ice fields, and first to land in Hawaii, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, right? But we look at that example that is often noted to be historical example. We see that the Polynesians, that the Kanaka Maoli, and all of these Pacific Islander indigenous communities have been navigating the oceans, right? So it's important for us to not see these teachings to be more aligned with interdisciplinary courses, but to interrogate how we are teaching science classes, right? So we get to teach an oceanography class, a marine science class. Why is it that we are only giving these notions of who founded those disciplines to white European men when we know that indigenous communities have contributed to this and much more, as you mentioned, where it goes beyond what we view as science today? And as I mentioned, right, how can we integrate these examples of Indigenous science into our core classes? And it's thinking within and not outside, right? Especially given that, as mentioned earlier in this conference, right, it's oftentimes hard for STEM professors or other professors to teach interdisciplinary courses within their own respective departments. But it's important for us to think how we can start giving recognition to Indigenous voices and sciences, even within the Western science courses that we teach. And it's been hard, especially as an Indigenous scientist who has navigated both the natural and physical sciences, to have that sense of belonging, right? And that's because when we look at the founders of science, they're all attributed to people who do not look like me, who may not even resemble your students today, right? And when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's also important to talk about belonging, especially given that if we're teaching our students that these are the founders of the disciplines we're teaching, then oftentimes they don't feel like they belong in those classrooms, right? Where they feel excluded, where they don't feel acknowledged or represented within the faces of the world-renowned scientists, right? That we continue to give recognition to. And to connect that right to one of the major themes of this conference is that oftentimes that notion of the nomos of the earth refers to a Eurocentric paradigm of the world order that relates to the conquest of the Americas and the European colonial enterprise around the globe, right? And we see how that's very present, especially in science, technology, and engineering, especially coming from that Western scientific lens. And it's important, right, especially when we're talking about Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledges, or Indigenous sciences, or traditional ecological knowledge, whatever term you decide is best for the community, to kind of grapple that there is ancestral knowledge, right, that has come from Indigenous people since time immemorial, where oftentimes even when we're teaching about math, where we're teaching about calculus, we forget to also incorporate Indigenous Maya folks who had a rigorous math system created, right, that obviously was tried to be destroyed during colonial colonization, where we have the Kanaka Maoli and other Indigenous Polynesians and Pacific Islanders who navigated the oceans right before colonization took place, but yet often they're not given those recognition in the mainstream discourses. So what is Indigenous science? How many of you have heard of Indigenous science before? Raise your hands. Okay. How will you define it if I were to ask you to define Indigenous science? And maybe we can pass the mic. Sorry, I have people running it.
Okay, well, I think I'm kind of cheating. But to me, Indigenous science, it has to do with, because when we talk about science, we talk about things that can be observed, tested, and replicated.
Yes.
Bringing indigeneity into that, it is something that comes from a long-standing, maybe an oral tradition or maybe a written tradition, but something that is explicitly cultural
Mhm.
and is geographically based.
Yeah.
So to me, Indigenous science, like when it comes to my heritage, is the connection that, my grandmother and my great-grandmother and all of the different medicine women in my family had, with the Andes Mountains or with, the mountains in Puerto Rico and the different herbs that exist there and the understanding ontologically of what they do without having to understand the biochemical mechanisms. So it's this kind of almost like a faith-based understanding of the place of certain things in the world. You don't need to test every herb and go into Pymol and model the different domains of the protein. You can just say I know because my ancestors have told me, and I can observe, when deer are sick, they eat this herb and they throw up and they feel better or whatever. But it is that type of more immaterial knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. Any other volunteer who wants to? That was a great definition, so thank you. Yes.
From what I know about Indigenous science, there was a lot of heritage in my family that was cut because of movements and all kinds of other dramas, but the Indigenous science connects. It's not an individual enterprise, and it connects both with the community, with the people around you. It's a collective enterprise, and also connects with the land. It connects with the place where you are.
Yes. Thank you both for those definitions. And I think it's also important to mention that it can also adapt, right? And I think that oftentimes when we hear about Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous sciences, we still have this romanticization, right? That I think one of our previous panelists mentioned, where there's this romanticization of certain Indigenous communities or communities in general, or these ways of knowing. But for Indigenous science, it's also adapting, and that's because of climate change, right? And I will talk about how the United Nations throughout different conventions and frameworks is starting to use Indigenous knowledges or sciences to kind of address climate change and try to mitigate and adapt to those climate change conditions. So when we think about science, and this was already discussed, right? We think of the traditional Western science where in order for something to be considered scientific, it has to follow the scientific method, right? Where we have to state a problem, formulate a hypothesis, design an experiment, collect data, analyze data, draw conclusions. And this is because we're trying to stay objective, especially when we're practicing science and when we're teaching science. But when we look at the history behind every concept in science, it's not really a cultural, it's not really a political, it's not really a historical. And a lot of my postdoctoral research was on the concept of energy. Who knows where the concept of energy came from? Has anybody taken any physics course? The concept of energy. Where did the concept of energy come from? No idea. Any guesses? Where did the concept of energy come from? No guesses. Yes. Yes.
I mean, I haven't really taken, thank you. I really haven't taken any courses in physics or something, but this may sound silly, but I think the concept of energy comes from definitely the sun and other big common natural resources. But sun is the big one.
Yeah, thank you. When you look at the history of energy, right? The first energy source came from the sun. However, yes.
At least in what I remember of my physics courses, the way the conservation of energy in particular comes in is from Newtonian physics. So
Yeah.
they attribute it to Newton.
Newton, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And I think
Actually, there are a lot of obscure passages in Greek philosophy about vegetative powers that talk about soul, and energy is part of what that is. But of course, those had been deleted. It's part of free reading, philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this connects my point, right? Where when we look at the history of energy, the first energy source was from the sun. But when we look at the Western scientific history of energy, is attributed to Newton and to all these European white scientists, right, who created the concept of energy. But energy as an entity and concept in physics was created to lead colonization, right? Because energy was what fueled the ships to come to the Americas. But yet when we teach about energy, right, we teach it as a cultural, a political, and a historical concept, especially in physics, where it's defined as an abstract concept that cannot be seen or perceived or destroyed. But yet when we look at, we dive into the histories of the concept of energy, it was during the Enlightenment period that fueled colonization, especially the sending of the ships across to the Americas. So, when I talk about the Western sciences and how we can start thinking within our courses to make them more interdisciplinary and to integrate Indigenous sciences, we can look at the historical, cultural, and political regimes that were a part of that, right? Because even during when Newton and Isaac Newton and all of these physicists were creating all these concepts and equations and formulas, there was a lot of religious battles between different churches, right? But yet when we teach about physics, there's no historical, religious, or anything entities acknowledged within them. And that's because, as sciences, we have normalized certain cultures, politics, and religions, yet we continue to ignore in other people who didn't have power, who don't have power even today, right? And one of them is Indigenous peoples. So as we defined it already, right, Indigenous science interprets how the world works from a particular cultural perspective and is often referred to as traditional ecological knowledge. The reason why I opt to use the word Indigenous sciences is because oftentimes when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, people tend to freeze us in time, right? Where they say, oh, your traditional ecological knowledge, while forgetting the fact that our knowledges are also adapting, right? Why Indigenous peoples and our knowledge systems are the solutions to climate change, because our communities are already being forced to adapt to those climatic conditions. We're being forced to, do water conservation a different way because there's no more water resources as a result of climate change. So that's what Indigenous science is. But then when we enter the academy, right, oftentimes Indigenous communities were seen as the research subjects rather than the researchers. And I think that this is for us to interrogate the ways that we do science today. We're also seen as areas of expertise rather than the experts ourselves, right? So for those of us like in the first panel, right, there was the mention of two-eye seeing where we're walking in two roads. I think it's also important for us as Indigenous scientists to interrogate how we're viewing our own communities, because they're also the experts themselves. And I think that in academia, right, in order for them to be your co-PI or your research assistant, they have to be in those settings. But oftentimes our Indigenous communities or peoples do not have access or that privilege, right, to enter those academic settings. So I think it's important for us to start unlearning and relearning how we view Indigenous peoples as research subjects and areas of expertise, right? Because they're also our collaborators and they're also the experts themselves. So I really like to use this diagram, especially when talking about Indigenous sciences. And what are one of the things that you notice about this diagram that speaks to you? Anybody wants to give us one of the things that they notice that speaks to you? And obviously there's no wrong answers. Who wants to go? Like, any volunteers? I'm gonna call on people. What is one of the first things that comes to you? Yes.
It looks like a web.
It looks like a web, right? Yes.
I noticed the combination of Western science tools and the spirituality core.
The spirituality core and the combination of Western science tools. Thank you. I saw another hand.
So it symbolizes a meaning of interconnectedness and something about like the hierarchy of everything and a totem pole.
So interconnectedness and the hierarchy, and you're bringing up the totem pole, right? And how that's in the hierarchy. I saw other hands. Yes.
I think it's really interesting to try and quantify Indigenous knowledge using like some type of graph, because that feels already like very Westernizing. And I guess to me, what I take away from this is how I feel like my beliefs are viewed by my Western classmates in my biology classes and in my chemistry classes, where if I am talking about something, you know, like even in a history class, if I'm talking about something and it relates to indigeneity, there is something on the surface that they, you know, can pick up and they can take away. But what they tend to leave undisturbed is the core of the belief. And so it kind of makes me uncomfortable because it feels very extractive in nature. Like, what are these data points that we can extract from indigenous spirituality without having to change ourselves, without having to give something back?
And in that line, do you think all of this can be compartmentalized the way Western knowledge is?
I think it can be compartmentalized, but not using Western analysis. So what I have been trying to do, and this is something that I had to learn the hard way, because what I found very frustrating in high school and now here in college is that I would try to relay these cultural beliefs that I had, and people would be like, oh, haha, so funny, like little shaman boy. It was never something that was serious. It was always something that was like, oh, that's so interesting, that's fascinating, but not for me, you know what I mean? And so what I have found has been really effective is, you know, borrowing from my ancestors and using storytelling, because what is far more effective than trying to say like, oh, my people believe, because already once you say like my people, or like you say like, oh, back in like wherever, people already start to externalize from that. But if you can tell someone a story the same way that our ancestors were telling stories in order to pass down knowledge, they can kind of see themselves in whatever protagonist you choose.
Yeah, thank you. And even in the web, right, it mentions stories as well. Thank you. Anybody else? And I saw you and then you, and then we can continue. Thank you.
Just I'm here dreaming a little bit to see dreams and plants so close together. That goes so far against what I had been trained to see in plants. And yet, you know, the stories, the ceremonies, the animals, and also the base, you know, dreams and plants as a base, as a core is really amazing.
Yeah.
Without romanticizing, but
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then the last, yeah.
I think it's intriguing to look at it in terms of systems.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, it's very strong. We see the social system here, ecological and environmental aspect. But the economic system is missing. The way that we are just looking at the three portion that we would see very common in terms of knowledge-based economy or knowledge-based business, knowledge-based, the materialistic part somehow is missing. So it's definitely the social, cultural, environmental, ecological aspect of that is very strong, and physical and metaphysic, because it talks about dreams. So it's not certainly just tangible. So that immateriality, I don't know if that word exists in English. I don't know. This word exists. Yes. So that type of metaphysic, I think that's intriguing to see. And also looking at all type of creatures, from plants, animals. So it's not just a human being as a, so in terms of equity, again, this is interesting to look at the systems. That is not just money and economy.
Thank you. And I think this is a diagram made for Native Science by Dr. Cajete. And I think it's important, right, for me to acknowledge that there has been previous Indigenous and Native scholars who have allowed us to reach this point where we can more openly talk about Indigenous sciences and Indigenous knowledges. And even the way that he drew this, you know, maybe there is no economic attributes to it, because oftentimes that goes against our beliefs, especially when we talk about capitalism, right? Where we don't view our plants and animals relatives as having any natural capital. And also going back to all of our relations, that goes to the spirituality, not from the Western religions lens, but from our spirituality lens, where we are in all relations with our non-living and living relatives. And I think that, you know, his main message was that this cannot be something that you can learn in textbooks, right? Where you can just check a box and compartmentalize them into boxes, because at the center of the core of Indigenous science or Native science is that spirituality and all of our relations, that are beliefs and ideologies that we're taught since we're born in our Indigenous communities. So I think it's important, right, to mention those two things. And then going into this, right, oftentimes what I tell many people, including my students and my colleagues, is that Western science is fragmented, right? So if we were to visualize this example, we are only looking at 2 or 3 puzzle pieces versus Indigenous science, since it's more holistic in nature, we're looking at the entire puzzle completed, right? And when we're doing science, when we're practicing science, it can often get tricky, right? Because we're trying to publish, we're trying to do all of these outcomes and outputs that oftentimes the academy or other Western entities are asking us to do, right? Versus Indigenous science is more holistic in nature. And this is why it allows Indigenous peoples to look at the entire ecosystems or systems, as somebody mentioned, where it's not just 1 or 2 things, right? Where we're looking at the entire puzzle completed. So in the book, right, especially in the premises, I talk about in order to heal our environments, which are all Indigenous lands, we must incorporate Indigenous voices, perspectives, and lived experiences. And oftentimes, I have gotten this question, right, especially from people who have picked up the book, like, what is Indigenous science? How can we learn it, right? And I think that the main emphasis of the book is that Indigenous sciences cannot be incorporated into anything without Indigenous voices, perspectives, and lived experiences, right? And as you have shared, right, it comes from your personal identity, indigeneity, where oftentimes, yes, people, because they cannot quantify it or they cannot extract it as easily, will dismiss it as a valid knowledge system, where it's like, you know, that you get called the shaman and things like that, because it's something that cannot be easily attributed and aligned to how we have been taught to pursue or retract, you know, the knowledge systems that we are able to pursue in many academic settings. So to give you a background, especially as I mentioned, that we're seeing within the UN conventions, United Nations conventions, how Indigenous knowledges is finally being acknowledged as useful to combating climate change. I will talk about the Rio Convention, and the Rio Convention relates to the 3 conventions known as the UNFCCC, the UNCBD, which is the Convention on Biodiversity, the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you will often hear about the UNFCCC's COPs, especially, for instance, this last year it took place in Dubai, because this is where you get all these government and politicians and policymakers coming to try to negotiate climate action and solutions for the rest of the world. And also the third one is the UNCCD, which is the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So given that, you know, there was a lot of UN SDGs mentions earlier, it's important, right, to acknowledge that the Rio Conventions are the conventions within the United Nations that have been tasked to address climate change, right? And these are the 3 different ones. So connecting it, right, to how supranational organizations such as the UN reproduce or offer ways to dismantle colonial logics, what is the role of decoloniality and Indigenous sciences in the context of supranational organizations, it's important, right, to acknowledge that in recent times we have been seeing how these Rio conventions have started to acknowledge Indigenous knowledges or wisdoms to be important components to climate change. So for example, in 2020, the UNCCD acknowledged Indigenous peoples' exceptional traditional and ancestral knowledge, which are real assets for sustainable management of our natural resources. And this is the first year where within this convention, we're hearing that Indigenous knowledges or wisdoms are actually important to address and manage natural resources. In 2022, the UNCCC acknowledged in a publication that Indigenous peoples have the knowledge and practices needed for the global community to implement and scale up climate action, right? So it was the first time that we saw in the UNFCCC this acknowledgement. That same year, the UNCBD passed the Common Montreal Target 22 that states to ensure the full, equitable, inclusive, effective, gender responsive representation and participation in decision-making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity by Indigenous peoples. We must respect their cultures, their rights over lands, and also traditional knowledge. So oftentimes, right, we are starting to see how these international, national government entities are finally acknowledging Indigenous knowledges, which kind of leads to this, as one of our panelists in the first panel mentioned, sometimes this romanticization of indigenous peoples or indigenous knowledge systems, because it's for the first time it's being cool, right? It's like becoming the trend to acknowledge indigenous knowledges. And for instance, the current administration has formally recognized indigenous knowledge as one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contributes to the scientific, technical, social, economic advancements in the United States and our collective understanding of the natural world, right? So within the last 4 to 6 years, we have seen how indigenous knowledges are finally being acknowledged. And I think that oftentimes, people ask me, so what does this mean for us, especially indigenous communities, is that we are in the gray area, right? Where we are seeing acknowledgements, whether it be land acknowledgements, whether it be acknowledgements of indigenous knowledges as important and vital to healing our planet, but yet we haven't seen that action or changes, right? So I think that oftentimes when we talk about what is our generational task, what is the ultimate goal that our generation should do, is that we should aim to move from acknowledgements more into action. And how will we do that? Obviously, is by allowing indigenous peoples to lead those movements, and also facilitating our conversations on the importance of integrating indigenous knowledges, especially in the Western science academies. And oftentimes, right, when we talk about indigeneity, especially when we're living in the United States, we tend to only localize it, which is very important. But in order for us to effectively address climate change, we also have to globalize our movements, especially when integrating indigenous knowledges. And a lot of the work that I do today is working with indigenous communities in Liberia. And Liberia has a very interesting history where it was colonized by the British, then they regained control of their lands, and then free enslaved folks from the United States went to Liberia and recolonized Liberia. So you see the suppression of indigenous communities in different multi-assets, especially in historical accounts, right? So oftentimes in global context, when we talk about decolonial or decolonization, it also involves, for many of us to be uncomfortable, right, with those power dynamics that exist, because oftentimes we associate colonialism to a certain whiteness, but in other contexts, whiteness is attributed to different people, right? In my countries, right, in Latin America, whiteness is different than the whiteness we view in the United States. And in the global South, especially in Liberia, right, it was recolonized by free enslaved folks who went into Liberia and took over, right, because they had to create a home away from the home where they were stolen. And obviously after they were, brought to the United States, they had to go back and rebuild their homes, right? Because they had lost their homes. I think that it's very important for me to, to learn what indigeneity means outside of the Americas, especially given that in this case for Liberia, right, indigeneity is very complex, and there's different colonial histories that we're often taught to do. So as part of my work, I also do many trainings with the communities, right? And oftentimes a lot of the community members are scared to address climate smart agriculture or to address other mitigation or adaptation strategies, because we have been taught as indigenous peoples that that's only what scientists do, right? So when I enter these spaces, I reaffirm the community that indigenous knowledges or local knowledges are very important, and they're effective in addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this allows the community members to see themselves as part of the equation, right? And one of the things that came from this training that I recently led in Liberia, which was facilitating what climate smart agriculture was and allowing the communities to decide what the solutions were for them, they realized that science can drive the direction, but they draw their own solutions, right? And that was something that an elder raised his hand and he was able to conclude for himself. And I think that shows that the power of indigenous knowledge is when they feel like they have the voices, where they have the platforms, where their knowledges are not being dismissed. And I think that it shows how we can heal our planet and we empower indigenous peoples to do that more effectively, right? Especially for those of us who are working in climate science, who are working within disciplines that are targeting climate change. It's important for us to know what platform or what role we should play. And given that, there are major inequities that Indigenous peoples face when it comes to climate change, like the degree of responsibility of climate change, the impact of climate change in the global south, the ability and capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change and the intergenerational traumas of climate change, as well as the gender disparities of climate change, right? It's important for us to bring to the forefront Indigenous peoples. And going back to this visual representation, right? Oftentimes Western science is very fragmented and, and Indigenous sciences is more holistic. How do we bridge that as Indigenous peoples and bring it into policy work? And this is where a lot of, we kind of make a lot of policymakers confused, right? Because we're trying to bring in this holistic nature. And this was a report that I was able to support, which is a commodity to common good, a feminist agenda to tackle the world's water crisis, where we didn't just talk about water and water rights as a silo, but we also brought in land rights, because you cannot talk about water without talking about land, where we also talked about climate change, and we also talk about Indigenous rights, and more particularly Indigenous knowledges, right, or Indigenous sciences, and how Indigenous sciences plays a role within these four political realms, right, of Indigenous rights, climate change, water rights, and land rights. And I think that, we're slowly starting to see some of the action, right, that I was talking about, how when we go back to where we currently are, we're in this gray area of acknowledgements, right? But I think that it takes a lot of us to be in those spaces so that we can start to see a little bit of action taking place. And as I continue the work, right, I'm working on integrating human rights into climate change, land rights, and Indigenous sciences, especially in the international forums such as, the UN. And I recently came from the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous issues that took place in New York and is still taking place today, where we're starting to move the agenda as Indigenous people so that we can finally be recognized for human rights, because everybody is in agreement that human rights are important no matter what government you're talking to. So how can we bring human rights into the picture when we're talking about climate change, where we lose a lot of governments, right? Because they, going back to one of the panelists, right, where they showed how Bush didn't want to go to the Rio Convention because there's no way that we can change our way of lives in the United States, right? That was one of the quotes. It's important for us to bring in the human rights approach so that we can have all negotiators in the same page, and also talk about land rights, right? And I know that many people are really uncomfortable when they hear the word land back, but I think that land rights are very vital, especially given that Indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. And I had a question for the audience. What percentage of the world's biodiversity is currently located in Latin America? Who can guess? So if Indigenous people steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, how much is it in Latin America? Percentage. You can guess.
Cute. I would say about 80 to 85%.
80 to 85. Anybody else? What percentage of the world's biodiversity is currently located in Latin America? And I'm asking that question because, those are our homelands. Who can guess? Any guesses? So we have 80, 85. Everybody agrees with that? Yeah. What will you say?
55.
55? Any other guesses? So in Latin America, we have 50% of the world's biodiversity, right? So we can see why oftentimes Latin America is the deadliest place for environmental activists, right? And a lot of those environmental activists are Indigenous peoples. And oftentimes we hear our Indigenous leaders, especially our Indigenous women, because they're the ones who are leading the movements in Latin America, say, you never think that defending our right to water and life will lead to death, right? And I think that oftentimes it's important, even for me as an Indigenous woman coming from Latin America, to acknowledge it's a huge privilege to be given this talk today, right? Because for these kind of conversations, my people are targeted back home, right? So how do I bring forward the privileges that I have to be able to talk in the global north about these issues, especially in international forums such as the United Nations? And land rights defenders are indigenous peoples who advocate for the protection of natural resources and indigenous rights. And oftentimes, because they go against multi-million-dollar corporation and settler government structures, they go missing, right? So we often see how many of our land and environmental defenders who are indigenous women go missing, and we all know that they're ultimately murdered, right? And I think that that tends to be the case across Latin America and the global South, and it's important to acknowledge that, right? So one of the panels that I organized, especially for the UN COP28 that took place in Dubai, was bringing in forward Latin environmental defenders, advancing climate justice, but centering the voices of our youth, right? And our well-known youth who have become social media influencers or who have those large platforms, we're bringing in youth who are still living in their reservations, who are in the Amazon of Brazil, who are in the south parts of Chiapas, Mexico, who are in Southeast Asia, working for tiger conservation, and also working in North America for their tribal sovereignty, right? And those were all the youth that I was able to organize so that we can give them those international platforms so they can speak about the importance of defending their lands and why defending their environment is vital to their indigeneity. So oftentimes we often feel discouraged, right? Because we don't know the role that we play within, dismantling the social hierarchies or in the decolonizing role. But I think it's important to bring in this map of social change of ecosystems, where it's important to acknowledge that we don't need only disruptors, where we only don't need just builders, where we need everyone, right? Whether you are a weaver, where you're more of a caregiver, where you are the researcher, right? The experimenter, or the storyteller, the healer, the guides. It's so important in the equity liberation for justice, solidarity, right? And I think that that shows the different vital role that our communities play. So I wanted to end it with my father's story, especially given that I started the presentation with his teaching where nature protects us as long as we protect nature. So the reason why he's a strong believer in that is because during the Civil War, the genocide that he experienced, he used to play a lot with this banana tree, and this banana tree kind of became his playground. He befriended this banana tree, and you would think that that's crazy, but that's what children do, right? Where they befriend animals or plants. And during this, he will also climb the banana tree to get bananas for the rest of his encampment, right? Because they were in encampment. So when he was 16, so 4 years into the war, he saw how his encampment was bombarded, right? And I think that that brings a lot of imagery, especially given the current days where we're normalizing these tragedies in front of us. And as the encampment was bombarded, he decided to seek refuge under this banana tree, right? Because as a child, the first thing that came to mind was like run under this banana tree. So instead of the bomb igniting, what he saw was the banana tree wraps his leaves to prevent the bomb from igniting. And oftentimes when you describe that, you would try to explain it in Western knowledge, right? Where you will say, oh, the bomb was malfunctioned, or it wasn't engineered correctly, or something was missing in that bomb. But in indigenous sciences, right, he strongly believes that because he built this kinship and relationship with the banana tree, where he protected this banana tree, it protected him in return, right? And oftentimes we hear how our ancestors dream of us, and in this case, the ancestor being the banana tree, right? Because if that bomb would have ignited, if that bomb, if it didn't wrap its leaves to prevent that bomb from igniting, I wouldn't be standing here today. And I think that that's the premises of the story of how indigenous sciences goes beyond what we think is normal, or what we have normalized, or what we have been able to solidify, right, within our Western ways of knowing, where indigenous sciences is beyond that. And that's why it's important to bring that to the forefront. So I know it's been a long day, so I want to thank everyone for staying here today, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me, and Paducci. And I hope that this leads us to unlearning and relearning the ways that we practice science in Georgia Tech and beyond. So thank you, Paducci.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. So now we have 15, 20 minutes for questions for the two speakers. Or
thank you for this presentation, Jessica. I think it's very illuminating, and I was wondering how would you see the prospects of continue the journey of bringing into, colleges and other spaces indigenous sciences? What are some of the prospects? What are some of the expectations of the communities? What are some of the goals also from the community base, no, from the bottom up? If there are specific or particular aspects of this of the indigenous sciences that they would like to highlight, and uh, up to a certain point, whether there are other horizons too, like beyond the university, what they would, what the communities would like to 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 move towards, I would say. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, so I mean, being on this campus has been very interesting. Like, I haven't been able to walk the entire campus, but even in the proximity where I walked, I feel like there's a erasure of the indigenous histories. Like, for instance, like whose lands is this campus built on? And I know that within indigenous histories, right, a lot of the indigenous groups from Georgia were relocated through the Trail of Tears into Oklahoma. So even bringing in that history and acknowledgement that, like going back to the presentation, right, we have to start with the acknowledgement in order for us to move into action and then changes. And then even going beyond that and bringing in that healing component, right, that often takes place. So, sometimes it's important to maybe go back to the indigenous communities and see whether they want to come study here, because that in a way is healing for themselves, right? Because they're returning to the lands where they were violently displaced from, their ancestors were. And I think that that's every generation's kind of willpower, right, to heal from all that intergenerational trauma. Another thing is to start having those conversations in our courses, right, where we don't just classify scientific history as a history professor's job, but also start implementing it within our own courses, right? Especially we teach in STEM, where I gave two examples, right? The concept of energy, we can easily integrate that in physics, not just focusing on the equations, in navigation, right? And how the ancient Polynesians, or even today, how they still navigate the oceans, we can integrate that in oceanography or marine sciences. So I think it's thinking within, so that we can bring in more voices, and hopefully doing that will bring in more indigenous students who want to pursue those fields of studies, right? Because for those who are here can attest that sometimes you do feel alone being the only one in those courses, and that goes to other communities of color as well, right? Especially given in predominantly white institutions, how can we bring in that belonging that often is missing from the DEI components and conversations? But thank you, but it's a long process, basically, my answer. Yes.
There's a question here.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's one of the best I've seen. Loved it. So, two questions. One is, oh, wondering if you have a website or a link where we can follow your work closely. And then two, for someone like me with a master's in city planning, and I've always loved like city planning, like especially something like planning for indigenous communities. Wondering if you know of any particular agencies or programs which employs people or has people for planning for is down planning or community planning for indigenous communities around the world.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, so I would give you my social media handles and stuff. But I think for the second question, right, one of the things that comes to mind is the houseless population that we often refer to as the homeless population. Because for instance, in Seattle, the majority of the houseless populations are Native and Indigenous peoples. Yet because the way the data is accumulated with the houseless population, Native Americans and Indigenous peoples are not accounted for, right? So you can give the population percentage of how many people are houseless within many communities except the Native and Indigenous communities. So oftentimes even, that just came to mind because, in city planning, it's even like starting to interrogate some of the data sets that are accounted for, because, I know that houselessness or, homelessness is very attributed to many city planning projects, yet, Indigenous people are nowhere to be found. So in Seattle, there's a project that was basically like a city planning project that is known as Chief Sealth Club, which is a home that kind of rehomes Indigenous houseless folks and helps them get jobs, stability, get, health services for whatever they might need. So I'm starting to see how in major cities where there's a big Indigenous or Native American population, they're starting to bring in those initiatives. But as you mentioned, right, they're all community based, because that started with the community advocating until they were able to get funding, right? Because it's all about the money at the end of the day to build this home. But then they're trying to expand that housing for, houseless Indigenous folks into a community that is predominantly white and nice in Seattle. And that community is going against that project. So even as a city planner, right, like how one can advocate for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous voices, because obviously people are like, yeah, I will donate to, for like this homeless project, but not in their own backyard, right? Because they don't want that in their own backyard. And this is in the I forget the community, what is it called? Why did I forget it? But it's a really nice community because it's near a big park, it's near the seascape, so you have a nice ocean view of the Puget Sound, and the community doesn't want it, right? And I think that it shows how city planning can help aid those conversations, especially advocacy conversations in that. But thank you so much for listening and being here, because I know it was a long day. So thank you too. Thank you.
I don't have a question, more a consideration, and it's got to do with the circularity of time. And because where I'm from, we don't believe in the linear, the structure. And I'm teaching policy. We're talking about SDGs 2030 as if things, play out that way. I just wanted to, and just by the way, thank you for today. I've been following you for a while, and today's been an incredible honor to actually see you speak live. So yeah, I just wanted, if you could unpack a little bit on the circularity of time.
Yeah, so I think that's hard, right? Because I think that oftentimes when we are, following the SDGs, or we're following the resolutions or any ratifications that the UN different bodies have made, they're based on time, right? And I think that sometimes one of the elders' teachings, especially as I enter more into the international advocacy realm, is that we need to understand that decolonization isn't something that can happen overnight, where the metaphor, that the imagery that I often use is like peeling onions, right? Where we're peeling different layers, and every generation has a task to peel that one layer. And as peeling onions, there's a lot of healing, right? 'Cause there's a lot of crying that is not intentional crying, but it makes us cry, right? When we're peeling onions. So I really like that, using that metaphor and visualization, because when we talk about time, right, we have to sometimes attest to the younger generation that is not going to happen overnight. Because I remember when I was younger, like I wanted things to be completed so fast, where I wanted change to happen overnight. But yet we're talking about colonialism as an entity, when in fact it has so many layers that we have to peel behind. So I think that teaching has kept me grounded, especially when, working with international advocacy such as the SDGs or the Rio Conventions, where yes, we want change over time, but we're bringing in so many policymakers, so many stakeholders, that it's sometimes hard to even write a sentence that everybody agrees to, right? And I think that that's why a lot of COPs, people see them as ineffective, because most of the time they're arguing. Like if you ever go into, where the main stakeholders are organizing the resolutions, not the side events, they're mostly arguing, where, and then with that argument, most of the people who are always against are the global north power countries, right? Where they're like, no, we're not going to reduce our fossil fuels, or no, we rather invest in carbon markets and, keep our corporations accountable for all the emissions that they're doing. So I think that I don't know if that's answering your question, but just reminding, your students that, every generation has an onion layer to peel, and that is not going to happen overnight. And I think that, but then it's a double-edged sword, right? Because we know that Indigenous communities, they don't have time. And I think that oftentimes, we have our own healing circles within these entities, especially in the UN, because this year we had a lot of crying, and it wasn't necessarily crying because they were excited. It was crying because they were like, we're running out of time, and these ineffective solutions are killing our people. So even then, it's like, how do we address the concept of time when we don't have enough time, yet these negotiations take so much time? So I don't know,
I also don't know. The healing needs to happen, but you can't rush it.
yeah, you cannot rush it. And then, and then without rushing it, our people don't have the resources, right? And I mean, especially when we look at the small islands, right, in the Pacific, they're destroying their islands where people are being displaced in large amounts because they can no longer live in their islands because their islands are sinking. So even then, how do we address those different impacts of climate change throughout the world? But thank you for that question, because I know it's hard.
That was an awesome question. I had a question, but also kind of a story that I wanted to share with you. So your book was very personal to me. Last semester I was the only Indigenous person that I knew of on campus, and also, especially when it comes to the Indigenous populations in Latin America, the Indigenous identities are not so discrete the way that people are used to, especially here in the U.S., where you think of like, oh, you're Indian and they live on the Indian reservation, and then there is everyone else, but it doesn't function that way in Latin America. So I am a Black man, but I am also an Indigenous man. I am also a Latino man, and it felt very difficult and very disenfranchising just every day to wake up and go into this institution that I felt and I still feel like truly does not want me. But what kept me literally from dropping out of Georgia Tech and like just going through and reapplying to schools was being able to just go back to my dorm room and just, read a chapter of Fresh Banana Leaves and be reminded of what I am fighting for, and be reminded that that Pachamama is always here for me, and that my ancestors are always here for me. And that was something that I was getting so disconnected from in my classes here. So I wanted to thank you deeply for that. And then my question is also kind of twofold. So one, how do we as Indigenous people and activists that do not have the privilege that other activists might have make our traditional knowledge important? Because already in my first year here, I have taken several leadership positions. I have spoken at several events like this, and already I can feel that the more that I speak up, the more that I am scrutinized, and the less that people would like to hear my voice. And then going forward with that, how do you exist as an Indigenous advocate in a society that is antithetical to your beliefs? Because I don't believe that property can be owned, that it can be bought and sold, but at the same time, practically, I have to rent an apartment. I have to have somewhere to live. Or, I don't believe in this Western pedagogical notion of taking examinations and just focusing on grades, but at the same time, I might be the only Indigenous person that professor ever interacts with in that class. So my performance matters. So how do you reconcile that and still make sure that, the point is getting gotten?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story, and that means a lot. And I think that oftentimes we feel alone, but it's important to remind ourselves that there's other people like us struggling somewhere else. And even like you sharing that, I would have never imagined there was an Indigenous student struggling at Georgia Tech. And I think that that's unfortunately the case, right? Because when I graduated from my PhD, it was only like 10 Indigenous peoples in the United States who were graduating with their PhD. So you look at the numbers and you get discouraged, right? Because you're like, if there's 8 of us graduating with our PhD, especially in STEM, we're not all in the same campus, right? So we're all having our own struggles independently. But I think that you should never feel ashamed of sharing your voice or taking up space, because for many years, remind yourself that there has been generations fighting for you to have that one space on this campus. And I think that, yes, we're going to get scrutinized. Yes, we're going to be labeled as angry, aggressive, or not professional, or but I think it's the reminder that you should take up that space. You should never feel ashamed to take up that space, because that was the space your ancestors fought for you to have. And even if you don't see it visualize or physically, it's a spiritual, right? It's a spiritual meaning. And I think that, it's just finding your people. Sometimes when I started graduate school, it was hard to find other Indigenous graduate students. So I went to the tribes and made my own aunts and uncles, right? So that they can help me with their teachings and their stories to remain in campus. Because, I was in the same boat where I was like, oh, I don't think, graduate school is for me. But then I had so many aunties and uncles, helping me, being like, continue doing that. And I think even as you mentioned, right, indigeneity becomes more complex when you're displaced from your lands. And I mean, that's something that my people had to experience. And it wasn't by choice, right? Because our parents or grandparents are never like, oh, we want to leave our lands because the US is much better. They never want to leave their lands, but because of climate change, because of genocides, because of wars, because of land conflicts, they're forced to leave our lands, right? And I think it's making sure that you don't lose that connection, whether it be like going to visit your homelands when you have a break to center yourself, or whether it is talking to your elders on WhatsApp, because sometimes they don't have a phone, like you cannot call internationally, or finding other elders from your communities that might be displaced here. But I think it's going to be a long journey and it's going to be hard, but remind yourself that you're doing this for the 7 generations, that yes, you're going to struggle, yes, there are going to be times when you want to quit, but thanks to you, in 7 generations, there's not going to be another Indigenous student struggling at Georgia Tech, because there's going to be 1,000 more, right? There's going to be bigger numbers. So just don't lose hope. I know it's hard sometimes, but hopefully that helps. But thank you for sharing your story, because that's important. Hopefully everybody who heard it will reach out to you too, because that's what we need. We built our own communities in the least places we expect. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering, in a country like the US and I think Western society in general, where we really encourage and prioritize making commodities of resources in nature, how do you see us incorporating indigenous knowledge and in general combating climate change when we're under the guise of a government that is encouraging making commodities of these things? And I on that note, you mentioned how a lot of people see COPs and stuff as ineffective. Do you think that what we have to do in terms of sustainability and moving forward, do you think that it has to be something that's more grassroots? Because it seems like on the international scale, when you have global superpowers like the US that really don't have that reverence for nature like Indigenous people do, that it's hard to find a way to move forward with that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that, even within the climate change discourse, right, we see that commodification through carbon markets. And I think carbon markets are very complex because there are Indigenous communities who are like, that's the only option we have, where somebody's going to be paying us to do what we already do, which is stewarding and caretaking of our forests. But yet the downside is that oftentimes, there's a lot of human rights violations where corporations are like, oh, we own the forest now, we're going to destroy it and create a new factory for our company there. Or oftentimes those same corporations are not being held accountable for the greenhouse emissions. So while they're, helping the Indigenous communities continue to caretake for their forests, they're also destroying the community's livelihood because they have to adapt to those climate change conditions that they're contributing to. So I think that oftentimes it requires us to do grassroots. And I think even though some people view the COPs as ineffective, it's because of grassroots organizations that Indigenous peoples were able to build the Indigenous caucus within the COP. And, something that is really exciting that obviously took 30 COPs to be able to come here. The UN COP30 is going to be the first Indigenous-led COP because it's going to take place in the Amazon city in Brazil. So even that win is historical for us, right? But then our elders are like, it took 30 COPs for us to host our first COP, right? And I think that, everything has to be grassroots because it's been that way. And, we have an Indigenous Peoples Caucus in the UN because it was all grassroots organization. But with grassroots, going back to the notion of time, right? It takes more time for people to hear grassroots voices, because, you know, if you don't have a badge that says, oh, you're the president of this country, or you are the ambassador for that country, you don't get to come into the negotiation spaces. But we're seeing more Indigenous peoples be in those spaces. And for instance, in the last COP that took place in Dubai, the Amazon, you know, that includes Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, brought 5,000 Indigenous Amazonians to that COP. So with that 5,000, they were a stronger voice, and that's why they're hosting the UN COP30 in Brazil, which is in Amazonian city. I don't know if the media has even announced that, but, you know, that was a historical win, because we are hosting our first Indigenous-led COP, and hopefully we start to see change. But again, that change is so slow that sometimes we become jaded or we lose hope, right? But how do we get attached to that hope so we don't become jaded? Because I think I was talking about how, you know, this is my first year being more involved in international advocacy, because I have left academia and do this more on this, you know, I still teach as part-time, but hopefully I don't become jaded in 4 years, right? I might come back and be like, it was terrible, like, don't do that. But, you know, it's keeping that hope somehow. But thank you for that question.
Well, I might use my privilege as holder of the microphone to ask perhaps one or two final questions. They probably will try and kick us out at 6 o'clock.
Oh, it's time.
And that's to ask, how important is the teaching and learning of Indigenous languages to the, you know, to the recovery and articulation of Indigenous science, as you've set it forth for us today, and in, you know, harnessing it to address the challenges of climate change? And then the second part of my question is, you know, what is your vision for Indigenous land rights, both in the short and long term? And are those the conversations that are taking place at the UN Permanent Forum?
So I think the first question, and I might have forgotten the question already. Can you repeat the first question? Sorry.
The importance of the teaching and learning of Indigenous languages.
So I think that's very important, because I think, for instance, when I went back to my community and I was talking to them about conservation and explaining it in our native language, they were like, what is that? Like, there was no word that translated to conservation. So that allowed me to realize that conservation is a Western construct that wasn't necessarily embedded in our communities. And even the premises of the title of my book, I didn't use conservation. I was trying to use conservation, like Indigenous conservation, but nothing translated from our language into that. So it allowed me to realize that for us, we view that more as healing of our planet and healing of ourselves. And I think that shows that interconnectedness that as Indigenous peoples we have. But fortunately, there is a lot of language loss. And I think that's a part of assimilation, you know, those colonial projects that have happened around the world, and also a part of the genocide that continues to happen with Indigenous peoples. So we're seeing many Indigenous communities either revitalize their languages, create dictionaries. Like, for instance, in 2005, a Zapotec scholar who studied at UCLA created our first Zapotec dictionary, which, you know, it's a Western tool, right? A written dictionary, but it's at least allowing us to adapt to how we can teach our languages to the younger generation, especially in college settings, because I think UCLA still has a Zapotec course that students can take, whether they're Indigenous or not, but that helps, you know, communicate with the community. So if you can learn an Indigenous language and then go back to teach it to those students in the diaspora, that's doing a great service to all Indigenous communities. And I think when it comes to land rights, it's a tricky conversation, because in order for land rights to be effective and implemented, the government has to be okay with that, right? Because no government wants to give land back to Indigenous peoples. And one of the struggles that I often see is land rights when it comes to women, right? Because even if you get the government to say, yeah, I will give some of the land back to Indigenous peoples, they always want to give it back to the men, but the women have no say, right? So how do we make land rights more intersectional, where we're also including women? Because, you know, in many, like, for instance, in many countries in India, once, or even in China, once a woman becomes a widow, they lose their property because they no longer have the men in their family who owns the land, right? So how do we bring in land rights more intersectional, where we get the government to agree to give back some land rights? They also integrate women, right? Because at the end of the day, when women, steward the land, there's more food production for their communities. There's more nourishment for their communities. And that's all evidence that scientists have been able to quantify for us, yet governments are still like, no, women cannot own land. So even having those conversations as a woman myself, right? Being like, what do you mean I cannot own land if I were to live here? It's, keeping that, I guess, a fine line between activism and advocacy, because you also don't want to scream in their face, even though you want to, but it's, drawing the fine line between both. And also, like I mentioned, everybody plays a role in the ecosystem of changes, and, finding our space within, what we are passionate about. So thank you for those two last questions. And thank you everyone for staying, because I know it's been a long day. So yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Last word? Okay.
Let's
Thank you. So, a burning question of mine is, with artificial intelligence and robots, the big thing in the future, um, I notice all like with that, it has its challenges as well as pluses. Well, what are some of the pluses you see with artificial intelligence in relation with the work with the indigenous science in the future?
Mm. So I think going back to that question, right? They're looking at, some indigenous scholars are looking at how to use artificial intelligence to teach languages, especially given that there is a big language loss in many communities, whether it be due to displacement or even internal displacement, right? Because a lot of people have to leave their reservations and go into the city to find a job, and then their kids grow up in the city. That could be a plus side, but I think with artificial intelligence, it also can put many indigenous peoples at risk. And I think, for instance, like artificial intelligence is being used to do bad things, even today in Palestine, where, if you haven't read the article, right, it's being used to see people and target them through planes, which, I think it all depends on who the artificial intelligence falls in whose hands, because, some people will always, they will always use certain scientific products for bad, and some of them will do it for good. But I think it helps a lot with the language teaching and learning. And some scholars are trying to use that too, because, it will become easier, because kids will want to learn their languages if there's like technology involved versus written dictionary, right? That, we have to adapt to the new generations as well. But thank you for your last question, and thank you everyone for staying.